Hello everyone, and welcome to the 244th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Joe Goldberg, from You. Ever since this show came to a close a few months ago, I've seen non-stop requests for this character to be covered, something that my wife had been pushing for since she finished the series as well. And now that I've seen the show for myself, I can see why. Joe is, to put it lightly, horrifying. A man who's a diabolical yet all too real depiction of the type of men who terrorize countless women all across the world every day. And as someone who accurately echoes that real-world terror, he's understandably been lauded as one of the most superb, intricate, and despicable villains we've ever seen in popular media. And in this video, we're going to talk about all the reasons why that is. However, I should let you know that though this story was adapted from a series of novels by Caroline Kepnes, there's still another novel in this series that hasn't been released yet. And the show also deviates from the story found there quite a bit. So we won't be talking about Joe as he appears in the books in this video, just so you're aware. But let me know if you'd like to see a video on the book version of Joe once they've concluded by leaving a comment down below. Now without further ado, let's begin. At the very end of this series, a defeated Joe Goldberg states that he never stood a chance given all that he was exposed to in his youth. And well, there's some truth to that statement, for Joe Goldberg's early life was nothing short of a tragedy. Born September 19, 1988, and raised in New York City by his mother Sandy Goldberg, Joe had a troubled childhood due to his exposure to the abusive and volatile relationship his mother had with his mostly absentee father, Rafael Pissarro, as well as the abuse he suffered at his father's hand, which included putting cigarettes out in his son's armpits. Now that's already terrible enough, and Joe would have suffered some adverse effects to his personality and mental health if his life had continued on this course. However, whatever may have resulted had he been forced to endure years of exposure to this type of behavior from his parents would have in all likelihood paled in comparison to what happened to Joe before such an upbringing could be realized. As I mentioned a moment ago, the relationship between Sandy and Rafael was abusive and dysfunctional, with Sandy working at times as a prostitute and frequently stepping out on Rafael, and Rafael regularly abusing his wife in turn after bouts of substance abuse. Now, when Sandy was raising Joe, she was negligent and harmful to him in that she would abandon Joe while she went to sleep with other men, and taught him that lying and keeping secrets is something you do for the ones you love. But she didn't abuse him, and she treated her son rather lovingly whenever she was around him, which of course led to Joe viewing his mother as his protector, savior, caregiver, and the only truly good thing in his life during the time he was with her. A shining light in Joe's otherwise dark and dismal childhood, but a shining light that would unfortunately contribute to Joe's entire life being defined by darkness. After suffering Rafael's abuse for some time, and finally having enough of it, Sandy decided that it was time to end Rafael's destruction of her and her son's lives after she had Joe lie for her about her most recent infidelity, and she reassured Joe that one day she would kill him. I don't doubt there was some truth to that statement, as most people in Sandy's situation would entertain thoughts of their abuser's death, and it's very possible that she may have killed Rafael had things continued the way they had been, especially when you consider she bought a gun and hid it in her closet, which she chose to show to Joe to emphasize that she actually would at some point. But whether or not that's true doesn't matter, because the real impact of her declaration here was the effect that it had on her son. Joe, a boy who feared his father and clung to his mother as a goddess, was given confirmation from that goddess's lips that the way to protect the both of them was to kill his father, a seed planted in his young mind that likely could have resulted in anything from a childish attempt to accomplish just that, or a plan to do so in a more sophisticated way. As chance would have it though, a stroke of dreadful fate would see Joe murdering his father with that gun his mother had hidden, choosing to do so after he couldn't stand watching him abuse her any longer while he was hiding in there during one of their arguments. Everything Joe had been exposed to led to this moment. His father's abuse, his mother's love, her promise to him that they'd be safe if only his father perished, and his desire to make that a reality. And from here, things only got worse for Joe. After he killed his father, Joe's mother decided that she was unfit to raise her son, and that the both of them needed a fresh start, sending Joe to live at a group home for boys. While this might have been a fine idea in theory considering that Sandy wasn't exactly Mother of the Year, this was one of the worst possible ways Sandy could have dealt with her and her son's issues. We can assume that Rafael's murder was covered up by Sandy somehow, and while you might think that was a good thing because it kept Joe and his mother out of trouble, all covering up his murder did was ensure that Joe had no real opportunity to deal with what he just experienced in a healthy way. Joe was a boy who had dealt with years of trauma, a boy who had just killed his father, and what he needed after all of that was someone to talk to that could help him work through all the issues that resulted from both. And while his mother certainly would have gotten in some trouble for this, trouble that could have possibly been lessened significantly should she have gone through the proper legal channels and explained the situation as best she and her lawyers could, her choice to take this path ensured that Joe would never get the help he needed, with her abandonment of him only compounding the trauma he already had through her absence, as well as the experiences he had at his new group home. where Joe was relentlessly bullied by the other boys for expressing that his mother would eventually come back for him. To make matters worse, Joe ended up forming a bond with a nurse at the home who was in a similar situation with an abusive boyfriend as his mother was, a woman who reinforced him lashing out his bullies as positive, much like his mother did when she taught him to behave in less than admirable ways when he was under her care. And after she never returned to work one day, Joe blamed himself for not acting sooner to protect her. After finding his mom sometime later by looking through his file and receiving confirmation that she wasn't going to be taking him back, Joe would eventually come under the care of one Ivan Mooney, a former Soviet prison guard and thoroughly damaged man in his own right, who would abuse Joe further in order to contain the monster that dwelled inside him and make him into the man he believed he needed to become, which included locking him in his signature cage for days at a time and teaching him lessons like, some people deserve to die, and that having darkness inside oneself is alright, so long as you know how to control it and hide the aftermath well enough. Now earlier I mentioned Joe's statement that he never had a chance had some truth to it. And the truthful part of that statement is that Joe in his youth never had a chance to prevent or deal with the adverse effects that his trauma had on his psyche on his own. When we're young, our lives are fully in the hands of those that are supposed to care for us. We receive some degree of autonomy as we age, especially in our teenage years. But even then, we're still essentially children who have little to no experience in anything. And so it's up to those that do to guide us in the proper direction. Joe had no such person who was capable of doing so. His mother abandoned him. His boys' home only served as a holding place where he could experience bullying, and Mr. Mooney was a psychopath who had no business guiding a young, troubled life into adulthood. Not once in Joe's youth did he have a chance to unpack his trauma and find healthy ways to deal with it. He only had the opportunity to make it worse as he was placed in terrible situation after terrible situation. Where the truth of Joe's statement falters is in his adulthood. Once he had reached maturity, it was more than possible for Joe to seek out relief for the anguish he had suffered and continued to suffer through therapeutic means, whether that be with a friend, partner, individual or group therapy, or even through a religious organization. Even though that's true, in reality, it was close to impossible for Joe to seek out help as an adult. Mr. Mooney had taught him that his dark side was a part of him, and he also taught him how to deal with it, so that was all taken care of. And after all he wanted to do was live a normal life and find someone to love who would love him in turn. So why would he need to? Yes, he had suffered some horrid experiences in his youth, but those were behind him. He was free to live his life the way he wished to, so there was no need to seek help. That's probably pretty close to what Joe might have thought whenever he entertained getting help for his issues, a notion that's made all the more evident by the fact that when Joe did go to therapy with Dr. Nicky, he only did so to further his own aims and learned next to nothing about himself because he didn't care to, which admittedly is the only reason he went to see him in the first place. But regardless, he still had the chance to learn something from him and didn't even consider it for a second. And just how impactful working through the things he was exposed to might have been is shown to us when Joe breaks down in the middle of his interview with a journalist in season 5 when he's explaining what happened to him when he was younger, which clearly displays for us that no matter how much Joe might have felt he had conquered his trauma, he certainly hadn't. So with all that in mind, I would say yes, in many ways, Joe didn't have a chance to stop his eventual evolution into a monster. But what I've just offered you is in no way an excuse for what he would end up becoming. Rather, it only answers why and how he became that monster. And watching him steadily become more and more monstrous as this series progresses is quite the sight to behold. And as a starting point on our journey to discover the intricacies of Joe's character, let's talk about his personality. Joe's personality is entirely dominated by his own twisted idea of what love is and his obsession with it. He is a lover of literature and a man who's taken up his mentor's mission of preserving rare books. But outside of that, everything about who Joe is on a daily basis is centered towards providing his latest obsession with everything they could desire from him. And that includes molding his personality in order to get them to fall in love with him in turn. Along with his obsessive nature comes a savior complex, as Joe isn't just looking to find someone to fall in love with, he's looking for someone to save. A woman who has been beaten down by society that needs a valiant protector like him to come to their rescue. An aspect of his person that works in tandem with the obsessive part of him that makes him willing to go far further for his obsessions than your typical obsessive would. That being said, his savior complex also applied to children and other people who he deemed to be in need of saving. But whenever he encounters someone innocent he feels needs to be saved, more often than not, he ends up ruining their lives in some way as he does with the women he targets, like Paco and Ellie. To make matters worse, the way in which Joe approaches his obsessions and what he thinks about others indicates that he's likely suffering from 2 distinct personality disorders that have some overlap in their symptoms: narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, and antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD. Now, with any disorders like these, a person doesn't necessarily need to have all of their symptoms in order to be diagnosed with them, and such is the case with Joe, but he does have a whole lot of them. And it's through these symptoms that we find the more repugnant and evil aspects of Joe's persona and the actions that result from them. So I think it's best that we take a look at the symptoms of both disorders that Joe suffers from and connect them to his actions to better understand his character. And as always, I'll be drawing the symptoms of each disorder from the Mayo Clinic's website, links to which you can find down in the description. If we start with NPD, we find that the first symptom listed here is a central component of Joe's personality, having an unreasonably high sense of self-importance and requiring constant, excessive admiration. Joe is a man who frequently professes his desire to be seen for who he is, a man who he believes is the perfect romantic partner just waiting to be recognized and loved for that perfect man that he is, a man who's willing to do anything necessary, and I mean anything, to make his object of obsession feel as loved as they possibly can be. The next few symptoms listed tie into this one, and those symptoms are feeling like you deserve special privileges and treatment, expectations of being recognized as superior, even without achievements, making achievements and talents seem bigger than they are, and a preoccupation with fantasies about success, power, brilliance, beauty, or the perfect mate. Joe doesn't brag about himself or his achievements too much, but when he is given the opportunity to do so, he typically will, especially when he places himself in circumstances where he's displeased his partner and tries to remedy their anger with him by reminding them how wonderful he is and how much he's done for them. All of which makes Joe believe that he's entitled to special treatment by virtue of his stellar and selfless character. And, well, fantasies about having the perfect mate are the only things running through Joe's head both before he acquires a girlfriend and after. Now, something Joe does quite effortlessly in this series that initially might seem like your average frustration with people and their behavior is his constant beratement of the people around him, particularly those who are close to his obsession. It seemed innocent to me at first because we are constantly shown Joe's thoughts, and I know that we're all a tad guilty of insulting someone in our heads when they displease us in some way. But with Joe, it's pretty constant, and there's few people in this series that Joe genuinely thinks positively of, outside of his chosen person. Behaviors that are indicative of two more symptoms of NPD, believing yourself to be superior to others, and only spending time with or feeling understood by equally special people, and being critical of and looking down on people they feel are not important. Taking advantage of others to get what you want is the next symptom, and I don't think I need to really dive into this one too much, as with nearly every action he takes, that's what Joe does. The next symptom, though, having an inability to recognize the needs and feelings of others, is very interesting as far as Joe's character is concerned. Joe prides himself on being the man who takes care of his woman in ways no other man can. He dotes on them incessantly, providing them with food, entertainment, financial and emotional support, and as much physical affection as they can handle. However, he doesn't do these things to specifically make them feel happy. He does these things to make them feel happy so they'll fall in love with him and make him happy in turn. For as much as Joe believes that his actions, illicit or otherwise, are done in service to the well-being of his soulmate, in reality, they are all taken for the purpose of conning them into viewing him as the perfect man who they can't help but love. But because Joe is so full of himself, he is completely incapable of recognizing this fact. And though he doesn't recognize it when this happens, it's when his partners inevitably become disappointed or angered with his behavior that this symptom really shines through. Because it's never, "I'm sorry that I hurt you this way," or encroached into your life in a way you didn't wish. It's always, "How dare you rebuke my affections after all that I've done for you and to make you like me." And the other symptoms of this disorder that Joe suffers from tie into this one fairly well. Those being a penchant for becoming impatient or angry when you don't receive special recognition or treatment, having major problems interacting with others and easily feeling slighted, reacting with rage or contempt, and trying to belittle other people to make themselves appear superior, having difficulty managing your emotions and behavior, feeling depressed and moody because you fall short of perfection, and having secret feelings of insecurity, shame, humiliation, and fear of being exposed as a failure. All of which are made readily available to us when Joe attempts to worm his way into people's lives, and especially when things start to go wrong for Joe, which is when he tends to be the most volatile. Another aspect of NPD that isn't listed here, but is very much prevalent to Joe's character, is a propensity towards hypocrisy, something that could go along with a narcissist's penchant for lying, but in Joe's case, is something separate from it. What I mean by hypocrisy is Joe's blatant disregard for his own flaws and his tendency to fault others for having those same flaws. Like when he calls Beck a monster for cheating and accuses her of painting him to be a monster when he very much is. Or with his entire relationship with Love after he learns her true character, admonishing her in his thoughts for being a psycho when he himself is her mirror image in nearly every way. Another aspect of narcissism that Joe displays as well are his wandering eyes, so to speak. In their relationships with people, narcissists are always trying to get what they want out of someone. And as soon as they stop pleasing them in some way, they'll start looking elsewhere for someone who can, which is something we see Joe doing multiple times throughout this series when his partners begin to fail him in some way. Now those are the symptoms of NPD that Joe displays throughout this series, which is more than enough evidence to claim that he suffers from this disorder. And as far as ASPD goes, well, he suffers from every single one of these symptoms, those being ignoring right and wrong, telling lies to take advantage of others, not being sensitive to or respectful of others, using charm or wit to manipulate others for personal gain or pleasure, having a sense of superiority and being extremely opinionated, having problems with the law, including criminal behavior, being hostile, aggressive, violent, or threatening to others, feeling no guilt about harming others, doing dangerous things with no regard for the safety of self or others, and being irresponsible and failing to fulfill work or financial responsibilities. As I said, Joe displays every single one of these symptoms in one way or another throughout this story. He cares little for right or wrong, so long as whatever he's doing suits his goals, and he has no regard whatsoever for any laws if they hinder his goals. He will lie, cheat, steal, kill, and manipulate others into doing what he wants them to do, which he accomplishes using intimidation or charm, depending on the situation. As for when we frequently see him questioning whether or not he or his actions are right or wrong, you have to consider that Joe Goldberg thoroughly believes himself to be a good human being who has been placed in some unfortunate situations through no fault of his own, and in order to make it out of those situations, he creates these convoluted justifications meant to service his own ego and his own feelings on the matter, at the expense of others. And while he might entertain thoughts of whether or not what he's doing is right, those thoughts are always centered around his poor me attitude in those situations. He cares little for the thoughts and feelings of others, so long as his needs are met. And as far as putting himself in danger and failing to fulfill obligations goes, Joe will often rush into a situation ill-prepared, suffer the consequences, and neglect his work or relationships in order to do what he feels he needs to do. Now, the one thing you might be thinking doesn't apply to Joe is not feeling any remorse or guilt, because Joe does express how sorry he feels for certain characters throughout this story, even the ones that he's harmed. His expressions of guilt and remorse often revolve around the following questions. Why did you make me do this? And how could you have brought me to the point where I had to put you down? The only guilt and remorse Joe feels is for himself and what could have been had the people he's killed only done what he wanted them to do and been who he wanted them to be. Something that's evident not just by his words whenever he reminisces about what he's done, but by the fact that even after expressing remorse or guilt, he continues to harm people anyway. Even when he does express some form of guilt that does seem genuine, like with Delilah's and Beck's murders, his thoughts still gravitate to himself as he asks himself, am I the kind of person who would do something like this? With his sympathy for them being secondary to his doubts about his own character, something that's completely thrown out the window when he finally embraces the fact that he does indeed enjoy killing towards the end of season 4. Another aspect of his character that might seem contradictory to a diagnosis of ASPD is the empathy he seems to display for people like Paco and Ellie. However, he's not necessarily helping these kids out of the kindness of his heart, but because he sees himself in them and thus resonates with them and their stories, giving Joe the opportunity to do for them what he wished someone had done for him when he was younger. Narcissism disguised as empathy that likely wouldn't have been displayed for any child that Joe didn't see some of himself in, something that you can also apply to his love for his son. All that being said, people with ASPD and NPD aren't monoliths, and they aren't necessarily incapable of empathizing, discerning right from wrong, or feeling remorse or guilt. Some are, but a lot of people who suffer from these disorders just have a much harder time with both, not a complete inability to do so, which would explain why he's capable of showing great love for his son and remorse for tragedies that he didn't wish to occur, like Delilah's death and the deaths of most of his partners. And because Joe is a man who believes himself to be a good person, but clearly isn't, he struggles with these darker aspects of his true self constantly, something that's made evident by his creation of and battle with his Reese Montrose persona through trauma and stress-induced dissociative identity disorder. This period in Joe's life is rather interesting, as it would seem that due to the stress put on his psyche by Marianne's rejection of him after he had assumed she would see him as the good person he believed himself to be, Joe's mind went into a tailspin and latched onto a man who had a similar story to his, but who had made himself into a far better person than he. And it was only through ridding himself of this aspect of his personality through the attempt to take his life, and his subsequent acceptance of it as a part of himself, that Joe finally started to come to terms with the fact that he was not just some man who was prone to experience misfortune in his life, but one who created misfortune and loved doing so. Now, as you can see, there is some overlap between the two disorders, but the symptoms of both are distinct enough to warrant two separate diagnoses. But what do these things make Joe? Well, the terms psychopath and sociopath while generally considered to be outdated, can be used as terms to describe people who suffer from ASPD in different ways. And since Joe does, would it be appropriate to give him one of these two labels? I think not. Joe clearly suffers from ASPD. However, his personality and actions don't really fall solidly into either camp, as the primary difference between the two is impulsivity, or a general lack of it, with sociopaths tending to be much less organized in their criminal endeavors and prone to wild and unhinged behavior, and psychopaths being generally more calculated and composed. Because Joe is both, being quite resourceful and strategic, while also behaving in ways that are reckless and impulsive, I'd say the best way to label him is as a malignant narcissist who suffers from ASPD, which sounds more than appropriate. Now, this is essentially who Joe is, and his personality is shown to us not just in his actions, but in the way he conducts himself as well. As though Joe is quite alluring and charming, especially when he's speaking, from nearly the first moment I saw him, I had always felt there was something off about him. Go figure. For context, though I recently watched this show to completion, I had seen bits and pieces of it since it came out whenever my wife was watching it, and I have a very distinct memory of the first time I watched this show for longer than a few minutes. As about 5 minutes into watching Joe work his magic on Beck in the first season, I offered my wife a very eloquent and poignant observation. This guy is a fucking freak. When I said that, she turned to me and said that she found him charming and passionate, which of course he is, as those are the primary traps he uses to ensnare his prey into his loving embrace. But when I truly took a look at him for the first time, I could see nothing more than a man who had dead eyes and an icy cold intensity about him. One whose words and actions seemed to be rooted in the mimicry of the words and feelings he'd seen other people display, but words and feelings that weren't genuine and that he wasn't even feeling in the slightest. As nearly every move he makes and every word that comes out of his mouth feels either forced or disingenuous in some way. Well, as it turns out, I was right, and the aforementioned disorders along with his savior complex and obsessive nature are a big part of that. However, these components of a person's personality don't necessarily make them evil. Plenty of people around the world have these disorders, and there are plenty of people who can get a bit obsessive and who strive to save those they believe need saving. But Joe Goldberg is without a doubt an evil man. A man who never wished to become evil and didn't think himself to be evil, yes, but an evil man nonetheless. And though you might think it's his obsession with the women he targets that is the root of all his evil, it's actually something similar, yet different altogether: his idolization of them. When Joe was younger, he had put his mother up on a pedestal. She was the only good thing in his world, and the only person who loved him unconditionally, for a time at least. And that love, a mother's love, is a feeling that's hard to match, let alone beat. And Joe is constantly trying to replicate the once unconditional love his mother felt for him by latching onto the various women that he idolizes. Most people will say that they love their partners unconditionally, and that only becomes more true as time goes on. But even the greatest of loves aren't perfect. There will be days where you and your partner disagree with one another and even argue, but you take the bad with the good because nobody is perfect. But most people don't have to deal with a stalker whose obsession with them has driven them to manipulating their lives and hurting those closest to them in order to create a relationship with them, which is exactly what Joe does. And because he does this, he always ends up getting the reaction you'd expect someone to have when they discover what he's done to them. And when his partners naturally begin to despise him as they learn more and more of the truth, Joe begins to fall apart as the woman he thought was perfect and who he thought loved him just as intensely as he loved her proves not to be and doesn't. Some people are looking for someone who can love them in the way they think they deserve. That's you. A quote from Dr. Nikki about Joe that sums up quite well who Joe is and what he's looking for throughout this story. This is why every single relationship we see Joe forming in this series, while all being different, all end in the same way, with murder, or attempted murder in the case of Marianne, Kate, and Louise, with his relationships with Love and Kate going past the point of no return not just because they started to displease him, but because he began to obsess over another when their relationship started to crumble, which is all part of the same cycle that is the madness of Joe Goldberg and his incessant desire to be loved by someone who he feels is perfect and who loves him perfectly. But what made Joe so good at doing what he did? Was it because he was the most masterful criminal and manipulator to ever exist? A man who was capable of molding any situation he was in exactly the way he needed it to go in order for his goals to be realized? No, not by a long shot. Don't get me wrong, Joe was good at being the stalker and white knight that he was. Otherwise, he wouldn't have gotten very far with any of the women he targeted. But even though that's true, it's more often the case that he was an incredibly lucky criminal, more so than he was a mastermind. There are so many instances in this series where Joe makes some sort of poor, impulsive decision when he's attempting to do what he does best, but he was usually saved by the proverbial bell whenever these things happened, and was able to continue his dark path. Moments like his stitching a key into his arm when he's battling with Kate towards the end of this series is an example of his criminal genius. But then on the flip side, you have things like his imprisonment of the man he's impersonating in Season 2, Will Bettelheim, and his maiming at the hands of Jasper, a man who the real Will owed money to, and the murder of Marianne's ex-husband Ryan, who nearly did Joe in when he was attempting to kill him in a parking garage. Something that Joe solved by murdering him messily, by pushing him over the edge of said garage, and then making it look like he was mugged. A significant deviation from his original plan that could have easily seen him getting caught. His efforts to manipulate people was generally pretty good as well, but Joe often slipped up in ways that forced him to think on the fly, which nearly got him into trouble. And as much as he used his charm to get what he wanted from others, he was also susceptible to such charms as well, especially from his object of obsession, as we can see when Beck successfully tricks him into believing she loves him when he has her imprisoned, and he lets her out, only to be immediately placed in the cage in turn. So if it's not his overwhelming intellect and skill that caused him to be so effective in his endeavors, then what was it? Well, like everything with Joe, his success in this story ties back into his obsessive nature. I sort of alluded to this a while ago with my comment about recognizing Joe as a freak from the get-go. But when you observe Joe from a distance, he's not really anything to write home about. Yeah, he is handsome, but he's not the most handsome guy out there. And in fact, he's quite creepy if you pay attention to him for more than a few seconds. But oh man, when you're a person he's chosen, and you interact with him for more than a few seconds, that's a whole different story. When Joe has decided that you're the one for him, you are now the only thing in the entire world that matters to him. From that moment on, every second of every day, all Joe is thinking about is you, how best to serve you, and how best to make your life wonderful, no matter what it takes. So when he finally finds the chance to speak with you, all of these things become immediately apparent. The way his eyes focus solely on you, the way he hangs on to and listens to every word you say, connecting with you in ways you couldn't have possibly imagined before meeting him. But most importantly, how he sees you, sees right down into your soul, and resonates with the brightest and darkest parts of your person to make you feel as if this man knows and loves you more than you even know and love yourself. Women all over the world are conditioned from the moment they can understand speech to look out for and settle for nothing less than a knight in shining armor or their Prince Charming, the perfect man who worships and protects them with a love that could shield them from anything the world can throw at them. And Joe's obsession is easily disguised as the kind of tender love and care that most, if not all, women are looking to find in a partner. And his intensity is hard not to fall in love with. In a world filled with terrible men doing terrible things, it's mesmerizing to find one that seems to be perfect. A man who knows just what to say whenever you need guidance, and who's there to hold you whenever your heart yearns for a reprieve from the darkness instilled within it by a world that seeks to bring you down on a daily basis. He makes it seem as if the entire world revolves around you, that nothing else matters but you and the man who could give you everything you've ever dreamed of, and more. But behind all that supposed love is a fabrication, for it's not as if he innately knows you. He knows you because he's been stalking you, because he's become an interloper in your life, who's latched onto you like a parasite. A man who is in reality a monster, a vindictive, spiteful, mean-spirited, and rage-filled monster who's just waiting to ruin you and everyone and everything that you hold dear. Yes, he would do anything for you, but really, he would do anything for himself. He'd lie, cheat, steal, and hurt anyone necessary to bring you closer to him. And most importantly, he would kill those that he believes bring you harm, whether they truthfully do or not, so he might create a world where you are now his everything in ways you would have never wished to be. And once you prove not to be everything that he imagined you'd be, then you too will meet your end. Over the course of this story, 23 people lost their lives as Joe attempted to find his perfect match, and many more along the way had their lives irreparably altered due to his actions, whether that be the many loved ones of the people who he murdered, or the ones who thankfully escaped his grasp, relatively unscathed. And once Joe had finally found himself in a cage that could hold the beast that he was, we find a man living as he always had, without shame, a whole lot of self-pity, and the idea that he wasn't to blame for all that he did. It's unfair, putting all of this on me. Aren't we all just products of our environment? Hurt people. I never stood a chance. Why am I in a cage when these crazies write me all the depraved things they want me to do to them? Maybe we have a problem as a society. Maybe we should fix what's broken in us. Maybe the problem isn't me. Maybe it's you. Those are the last words that we ever hear from Joe Goldberg. And as I explained earlier in this video, there is some truth to them. Joe in many ways was also a victim who had little hope of getting the help he needed to become any semblance of a functioning, normal human being. And yes, hurt people do hurt people. In some cases, like Joe's, it's close to impossible for a person to keep the monster that others forced inside of them at bay. For others, it's possible to fight those demons and quiet their voices enough so they can live their lives unburdened by all the darkness that helped make them who they are. But you know what's the easiest way to prevent men like Joe Goldberg from becoming a monster like the one we're shown in this story? Ensuring that love and empathy are always the first things on our mind when interacting with people, especially our children, and eliminating any possibility for abuse and neglect to be forced upon them by our actions. There would be no Joe Goldberg without the negligence of a mother and the abuse of a father. There would be no Joe Goldberg without the cruelty of one's peers and the sad conditions of institutions meant to care for the wayward and vulnerable. There would be no Joe Goldberg if there weren't people like Ivan Mooney enhancing the evil in those under their care instead of making efforts to keep it at bay. But these things did happen, and the result is all too predictable. That being said, again, what happened to Joe is not an excuse for what he's done. It's an explanation. And it's through that explanation that we can understand how people like him are created and how to prevent the creation of them in the future. For though Joe once was a victim, by the time this story begins, he is a victim no more. And when people like this do appear, and they do things that Joe did, there is no better label for them than to call them evil. Evil people who take the lives of others to satisfy their own desires, without regard for anyone's thoughts or feelings but their own. Blights on society that more than deserve the punishment they earn for the atrocities they commit. And though everything that Joe did in this series is horrifying, there is nothing more horrifying about Joe than the fact that he, out of countless killers like him that have been presented to us in fiction, is someone who I could easily see being real. A man whose presence in this fictional version of our own world reflects the actions of some of the real monsters that have already sowed so much pain in our world, and the ones out there still lurking in the shadows who seek to do much the same. Because that is unfortunately true, it's unfortunate that there was some more truth to Joe's final words in this series, that being his statement that maybe it's you who's to blame for who he is and what he's done. Now I want to be clear, it is never, ever, ever the victim's fault. Save for perhaps the less than innocent individuals we find Joe interacting with in this story, like Jasper and Tom Lockwood. Not a single one of Joe's victims deserved what Joe did to them, especially not the women he entered into relationships with. That being said, the world is an incredibly dangerous place for women. A lot of women don't walk outside at night in fear of getting attacked by those who prowl the streets looking to take advantage of them. Most girls I know who have gone out on dates will text a friend the address of their date's home just in case the unthinkable were to happen. Parking garages are notorious for being places where great harm can come to a woman if they aren't careful. And while it is unfair that women have to walk in this world looking over their shoulder because there are so many animals wearing human skin amongst us who look to prey on them when they're in situations like these, and many others, it's unfortunately the reality we live in. So as much as I deplore the idea that all women out there should be as vigilant as they are when moving through the world, I cannot emphasize enough that vigilance in all aspects of your life is something that should be of the utmost importance to you, especially when you're building a relationship with someone, a person who you invite into your life that is then granted access to an infinite number of ways to harm you. Love is often blind, and it's difficult to see the faults in a person's character when your heart is fluttering. But I beg you, if a man is otherwise an angel, but becomes violent on occasion, take a moment to evaluate whether or not that's something that could lead to great harm for you or someone you care about in the future. People tell lies. It happens. But if you find a man lying to you often, don't just buy the excuses they give you when you catch them, or take them at their word when they promise to be better. As much as I don't want you to have to question everything in your relationship, if it's something that leads to you being happy, safe, and healthy, then unfortunately, you should. And the reason I even felt the need to say all of this to you is not to blame you, not to tell you that you've done anything wrong, or that there is something wrong with you, but because I'm concerned for you and your well-being. Because I want each and every woman who may be watching this video to live to be 120 and die of natural causes, if at all possible. And for that to happen, you must be vigilant, no matter how unfair that might be. This is even more true for those of you, who might be most of you statistically, who have suffered through some sort of abuse or trauma in your life. For like moths to a flame, men like Joe Goldberg have a keen eye for those who are hurting in this world, and they are excellent at healing some of the pains you felt all your life in the beginning, so they might cause you ever more pain as they latch onto your soul, as was the case for every woman who Joe set his sights on in this story. women whose families had abandoned or harmed them, and who had suffered through the abuses of terrible partners who had caused them so much pain, but who were ensnared in the web of a demonic spider whose love-soaked venom only left them far worse off than he had found them. But none of these women are at fault. They could have been more vigilant, yes, but their absence of vigilance is not their fault. It's Joe's fault for being the man he was, and luring in those so desperately in need of truly being loved and seen for the beautiful people they are, and warping love, the most wonderful thing in this world, into something insidious and terrifying. A child who once deserved pity and sympathy for all they experienced, but a man who deserves none after becoming the beast he became. A beast that shall always and forever be remembered as a dark stain on the lives of so many, many people, and a creature made of pure evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Joe? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, my members, anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and especially Elijah Kai VA, our Dark Lord channel member. And a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.